Hello everyone, my name is Kamphuis. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Cluster of Excellence for Religion and Politics at the University of Münster. And today I'll be giving a talk with the title The Spirit of the Young, Muslim Students' Activism in Colonial Indonesia, 1920s-1930s. So let me start with a brief introduction. In 1926, the Indonesian female student Jawana Basir wrote a passionate plea for the right of Muslim women to receive education. She referred to prominent educated women in the Quran to prove that it was not sinful for women to study, as some men had argued. She also emphasized that there were Muslim countries, such as Egypt and Turkey, where women worked as journalists and even held positions in the army. Indonesia should follow these examples of Islamic progress, Jawana concluded. Jawana Basir was not a prominent scholar of Islam. She was a teenage student at an Islamic school in the Dutch East Indies, so Colonial Indonesia, and it is unlikely that she had traveled far beyond West Sumatra, the region where she studied. And behind me you can see a map of Indonesia. West Sumatra, the region that I'll be talking about today, is located here, so in the west of Indonesia, close to Malaysia. So Jawana evoked notions of transnationalism and a profound connection to the broader Muslim anti-colonial movement in her article. The platform that she chose to express her opinions is significant here. The article appeared in Soeara Moerid, which is translated as The Voice of the Students. This was a Malay language magazine published by the Persatoean Moerid-moerid Dinijjah School, or the Union of Students of Religious Schools. And from now on, I'll refer to this organization as the PMDS. This magazine appeared from 1925 to 1926. 6 years later, the PMDS published a second magazine, Kodrat Moeda, or The Spirit of the Young. All articles in these magazines were written by students in secondary school and higher education. The archives of the Student Association have not survived, but it is mentioned in memorial books, memoirs, and reports of the colonial police. It was an organization with an outspokenly anti-colonial standpoint. This was not without its risks, as the Dutch colonial police was extremely alert on Indonesian nationalism in the 1920s and 1930s. In this talk, I will use the PMDS magazines to argue that it is useful to analyze this organization as a youth movement. In other words, I want to define the Students' Association not only in terms of its political and religious background. I believe it is important to pay attention to the age of its members as well, because they organize themselves around an idea of youth. Seeing the PMDS and other anti-colonial students' movements like it as youth movements allows us to look at Indonesian anti-colonialism from a new perspective. More specifically, it reveals transnational connections, in a broader context of youth activism that transcends West Sumatra and even the Dutch East Indies. This is significant because histories of anti-colonial organizations in Indonesia, as well as broader Southeast Asia, have often been written from an institutional point of view. The activities of young people at the heart of such movements have received less attention than, for example, the biographies of prominent leaders. Before I move on to highlighting these transnational connections in the student magazines, however, I would like to devote a few words to the specific regional context in which the PMDS emerged. West Sumatra is one of the regions in Indonesia with a very strong Muslim identity. Since the introduction of Islam in the 16th century, a rich tradition of Islamic education for both boys and girls has existed in the region. Traditionally, this focused mainly on reading the Quran and the Hadith, the words and deeds of the Prophet Muhammad. Westernstyle schools started to emerge in West Sumatra from the mid-19th century onwards and became more widespread around 1900, when the Dutch colonial government started to provide limited educational opportunities for Indonesian children. Colonial officials noted that the interest for Western-style education was particularly high in West Sumatra. The colonial school system was divided into two separate systems, one for children with European legal status and one for children who were classified as native, in racist colonial discourse. As a result of the limited public investment in education for Indonesian children, hundreds of privately funded initiatives emerged, ranging from rudimentary classrooms to large schools that received subsidies from the colonial government. The background of the Persatoean Moerid-moerid Dinijjah School, however, was very different. This organization emerged from schools connected to an anti-colonial Muslim movement known as the Kaum Muda, or Young Group. This reform movement argued for the modernization of Islam. As several scholars have noted, the Kaum Muda, like other Muslim reform movements at the time, was an attempt to formulate a response to Western colonialism. The Kaum Muda proposed a new model for religious education, and this completely transformed educational practice in West Sumatra. Traditionally, religious education had relied on oral transmission of knowledge in prayer houses and in religious boarding schools. Kaum Muda schools, by contrast, were modern school buildings with age-weighted classes, Western-style furniture, blackboards, and new teaching materials. While some Kaum Muda schools were co-educational, there was also a renewed attention for girls' education. In 1923, a female scholar of Islam opened the first boarding school for Muslim girls in Indonesia. The most important feature of Kaum Muda education was that it combined secular and religious knowledge. Teachers saw subjects like mathematics, geography, and even English as crucial for the building of a new generation of modern Muslims. In line with this approach, the Kaum Muda also put a strong emphasis on higher education. The PMDS Student Association was established by young people who studied at teacher training colleges and high schools. Crucially, the Kaum Muda incorporated a strong nationalist element in the ideals of religious reform. It saw Dutch colonial rule as illegitimate and strived for the unification of Indonesia. All in all, the Kaum Muda thus represented a specific strand of political Islam that was deeply rooted in schools and, by consequence, closely connected to the young people who studied there. In 1933, the government reported that there were as many as 45,000 students in West Sumatra in Reformist Muslim schools. So this was a very significant movement. And especially because it was such a widespread movement, the Dutch colonial government saw the Kaum Muda as a dangerous threat to its authority. Schools were frequently raided. Teachers could be banned from teaching and even faced imprisonment or exile. The Indonesian National Archives in Jakarta hold a police file that documents a raid in several secondary schools in 1933. The police seized many nationalist pamphlets and magazines, as well as essays in Arabic that decried Dutch colonial rule. In their essays, students compared the colonial education system to, and I quote, a dangerous poison that was responsible for the enslavement of Indonesian children. Several students at this school were found to belong to the PMDS Student Association. So, to understand this reaction of the government, we need to take a closer look at the political outlook the PMDS expressed in its magazines. In the first issue of The Voice of the Students, published in 1925, the editorial board stated that it aimed for progress within the framework of true Islam. This was in line with reformist religious interpretations, which promoted an emphasis on scripture and a move away from local religious traditions. The PMDS affirmed that it would work together with other student associations to defend itself against its political adversaries. Unsurprisingly, it was not long before the magazine attracted the attention of the colonial government. The police saw the PMDS as dangerous because its publications could potentially mobilize large numbers of young people. 1 year later, The Voice of the Students was shut down and the editor-in-chief was sent to a prison camp. When the PMDS started its new magazine, The Spirit of the Young, in 1933, it took an even more explicitly anti-colonial stance. The editorial board declared that it would respect and honor no one else than God and the Quran. They called upon young people to unite themselves, urging their readers, and I quote, The Indonesian homeland calls upon its sons and daughters. It asks for effort and vigor, for honesty and sincerity of the heart, for determination and readiness. They also quoted Soekarno, the leader of the Indonesian anti-colonial movement, who, in 1945, eventually would declare Indonesian independence. The journal protested against government restrictions on independent schools, saying that this would hamper the development of the new generation. It's unclear whether the spirit of the young was also shut down by the police, but it seems very likely that it was at least under police civilians. So let me now move on to the specific aspects of transnationalism that occurred in these two student magazines. I would say that from the first publication onwards, the magazines adopted a transnational point of view. The Voice of the Students offered subscriptions to readers abroad and had close connections to Indonesian students in Cairo in Egypt, which was a center of Reformist Islamic learning. The students who wrote in the journal compared the position of Islam in Indonesia with other countries such as Turkey, Morocco, and Egypt. Especially female students like Joanna Basir, who I mentioned briefly in my introduction, Special female students referred to the efforts of women abroad as they argued for women's education and against forced marriages. At the same time, authors tended to criticize the respectability of girls who they considered too westernized. Like many Southeast Asian nationalists at the time, PMDS members encouraged readers to adopt Western customs only to the extent that they were congruent with what they described as Eastern culture. They mentioned Japan and China as examples of countries that had successfully modernized without their citizens becoming, and I quote, Europeans with Asian skin. On a more practical level, activities that were announced in the magazine likewise show that the PMDS drew upon global youth movements. Its members were active in an Islamic scouting organization, which showed great similarity to other scouting clubs in the Dutch East Indies and around the world. The pages of the magazines were filled with announcements for lectures, political meetings, debating clubs, and excursions. There were also separate girls' clubs where young women debated the role of Muslim women in society, and the scouting club had a girls' branch as well. All in all, the magazines of the Persatoean Moerid-moerid Dinijjah School give an insightful first impression of the position of this student association. The students who wrote these journals clearly considered themselves to be part of a new generation of Muslims and Indonesians. They aimed for modernization of their religion and wider society, and did so within a framework that was not only Islamic and anti-colonial, but transnational as well. They strongly identified with their student status and saw education as crucial to the attainment of their goals. To conclude, I would like to make a final suggestion. The connection between reformist education and the West Sumatran youth movement does suggest that youth, as it was used in this context, partly hinges upon age-based identities that started to emerge as westernized education gained more ground. More research is needed to determine to what extent ideas about modernization and age, as propagated within the PMDS and other student associations, were influenced by colonial constructions of life stages. This will be helpful in locating the historical specificity of youth in this context. In other words, it is important to determine what West Sumatra student activists were talking about when they described themselves as the young generation. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to discussing my paper with you at the conference of the Children's History Society in June. Thank you very much.